You were here yesterday too?
So now we're going to get
Was it good?
that out of the way. Let's just put our feet flat on the floor. I need this as much as we all do. This is going to be a little bit like an unconference. We're going to just take 3 deep breaths. I'm going to find my anchors. People in the room. And open our eyes. Again, welcome. I want to just do a few more thank yous slower to all the people who supported me the last few months, the organizations, and individuals. I just kept reaching out for feedback of what educators want. And there's so many nonprofit organizations in mindfulness education that have been mentoring me along the way. My name is Tracy Heilers again. I'm a parent at St. Charles, D303. Our 3 kids go here, and then my husband is Department Chair of PE and Health in Carroll Stream. So yesterday I kind of talked about some of the things that happened in the last year that spurred me to have this culminate today. Meeting Barnaby Spring at Wisdom 2.0 in San Francisco at this year's last time. Watching the May I Be Happy film in the spring, but also we had a few events in our personal life that really, like, for the last few years I've kind of been getting ready, you know, staying home with the kids, going into their schools, teaching mindfulness and yoga whenever I could. But with the kids a little bit older, I was just kind of waiting for, you know, that sign of what I should do next. Then I heard at St. Charles that an 8th grader committed suicide in my son's school. And so that was like, and you know, my kids, they would be in the tier 1 group. They wouldn't get interventions, they're doing great, they don't get stressed out. But even for them, like, I want them to be, you know, when you start practicing mindfulness, then the first thing you're just like, I wish I'd learned this as a kid. Okay, and then a few months later, another 9th grader at St. Charles commits suicide. And a few months later, my husband's best friend, Mike, who they coached together for years cross country, and we took him under our wing when he tried to commit suicide a few years ago. And a wonderful teacher, wonderful English teacher, the kids loved him, but he's just a sensitive soul. You know, evaluations and the assessments really, you know, that we have to do as a school, they were really stressful for him. And it was a rough year. We left for spring break knowing we were worried about him. We came back, he didn't come to school. Gary went to check in on him because he doesn't have family nearby, and they found him. He committed suicide. So, like, we talked yesterday, Barnaby, about, like, our theme for today is laughter, discovery, beauty. And we had all those things with Mike, like he was Uncle Beto to my kids, because we don't have family in the area either. So, we're here for you, Mike. Thank you for being here with us, and sometimes we need something in our life to do something big like this. So I thank him for that. What I want us to do now is just take a few more breaths. So that's my why of why I'm here, why I'm doing this. So I just want us to take a few more breaths and think about your why you're here. Visualize maybe a student or your child, someone maybe in your class, how you want to be there for them. Set your intentions for the day of what we call them, we used to run a sports camp, but your outer goals and then your inner goals. So think of what you want to learn today for your outer game. And then what you want to learn and practice for your inner game? Like, what qualities do you want to express today to everyone you meet? Think about some staff or colleagues in your life, because this conference is about it. The education not just being about assessments and data and academics, but about the mental health, the social emotional health, that those inner things that we don't always see of both our students and our teachers. Are the three pillars, you can keep your eyes closed still if you have them closed, if you like that, of the coalition are mentoring, resources, and training. Yesterday we had a big mentoring day of supporting, so just think of someone maybe you can support in your life with what you are going to learn today. So think about maybe a mentor that you've had and just give a thanks, appreciation for them. Today is about resources, so listen to your body today. We don't need to have it all figured out today. You just see what resonates with you. There's no hurry in any of the work we're doing. Our name is Educating Mindfully, so that doesn't mean we necessarily have to be teaching mindfulness to the students. It starts with us. Being mindful about how we teach mindfulness. And then we can open our eyes. So I want to introduce Matt Dewar, our COSEM president. I met Matt this summer at the Midwest SEL Summit run by Carla from Mindful Practices in ASCD. And hopefully they'll do it again. It was amazing. It had a lot of mindfulness sessions. He was at our Oak Park. I saw him on a panel. I immediately figured out where he was, emailed him. We talked. He has a TEDx talk. I think I've watched it 20 times. And he, of course, we resonated with each other, and I wanted him to be kind of the face, because I'm a parent, not an educator. I want to serve the educators. So our board of directors is all educators, and then we're having a steering meeting tonight that I can learn about how I can help you guys, help everyone. And he's at Lake Forest High School. He's a teacher, as well as now their wellness coordinator, learning facilitator. He's leading a 2 o'clock session today on this wonderful Wellness for Life program that all of their freshmen take, a full year course that has PE, health, and mental health all combined in. So come on up here, Matt. Thank you for leading us off today.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. So I just want to follow up on your story real quick. So I was at the Midwest Social Emotional Learning Summit, and I got home and I had an email from this lady, Tracy, and she's like, can we talk on the phone? And our first conversation, she didn't show any of her cards. So she was just asking me all these questions. And I'm thinking, what does this lady want? What is she after? She was very clearly motivated by something. And I don't think it was till the second or third call where you finally unleashed your vision. And I remember thinking, okay. Seems pretty epic, but sounds awesome. And the fact that we're both standing here right now and you brought this to fruition is pretty remarkable. So I want to take time today for the next 30 minutes or so and share with you perspectives that have emerged for me over the last 20 or so years practicing mindfulness personally, and over the last 5 years teaching mindfulness in educational and athletic spaces. And the reason I want to focus on perspective and not practical know-how is because for the rest of the day, you're going to have the opportunity to dig in to techniques and programs and all sorts of things. And I think that stepping back and looking at maybe the bigger picture of mindfulness and asking some bigger questions helps then equip us to more effectively select the techniques and the programs and the resources that are useful for us and our goals. This is actually part of a manuscript I'm working on, and I picked 4 of the kind of insights that are a part of this manuscript. An insight is basically like a chapter. And I want to start with one that doesn't necessarily have to deal with mindfulness in schools directly, but I think a number of you are probably new to the field of mindfulness or to the whole realm of mindfulness, and you're kind of wondering, it's like a wilderness. Where do I go? Where's a trail that I can get on and start making some progress and getting somewhere? And so I want to start with my own personal experience, and this is more of a cautionary tale about my introduction into mindfulness. This is Colby Sawyer College in New London, New Hampshire, and I was about 19 years ago a sophomore. See where that ivy is? It was on the 3rd floor in that classroom, and I was in an adventure literature course, and we had just finished reading the book Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. It's a story of Chris McCandless. It's a true story where he graduated with Emory from honors in the early 90s, burned all forms of identification, and just went off the grid. 2.5 years later, his body was found in rural Alaska, remote Alaska, everywhere is rural in Alaska, in an abandoned moose hunting bus that was left for moose hunters. And so we had just finished reading the text, and my professor, Ann Page Stecker, she looks at us, and she says, "Was Chris McCandless courageous or crazy?" And without missing a beat, basically everyone in the class was like, "He was a nut job. Loonies go off into the wilderness every year, and they don't get books written about him, and he's just got lucky that someone became interested in his story." And then Professor Stecker just quietly nodded her head. And then she said, "I want you to raise your hand if you're in this classroom right now because there's nowhere else in the world you want to be." And no one raised their hand. She said, "Yeah, that's what I thought." She said, "Maybe you're all just jealous of Chris McCandless because you don't have the courage to go pursue what you want to pursue, what your dream is, and you're too scared to pay potentially the ultimate price for it. What's to stop any of you from right now getting up out of your chair and walking out that classroom door and pursuing the life you want to live?" I heard this. I got up out of the chair. I walked out the door. I went down to the registrar. Her name was Nancy Teach. I said, "Hello, Nancy. I want to withdraw from school." She said, "Matt, what? What are you talking about? Why do you want to do this?" I said, "I want to go live with Buddhist monks." This is a backstory to this. And she's like, "Have you lost your mind?" And I said, "No." And I had lost my mind. She said, "Did you talk to your parents about this?" I said, "Yeah." Hadn't said a word. So I withdrew from school. And then I had a phone conversation with my dad where I can't really repeat most of the conversation because it was laced with profanity. But he brought it to my attention that he just lost a semester's worth of tuition for no credit because it was past the refund date, something I didn't consider in my romanticized moment of, carpe diem. Long story short, I went home, back home. My dad first told me I could walk home, but then he called back later and said, "Okay, we'll get you home, but then you're on your own." And I worked some odd jobs, and I saved up enough money, and I got a ticket, a one-way ticket to South Korea, and I went to Gumong, South Korea, to live in a monastery. And this is when I arrived at the monastery. That is Cheongdo Sunim. And Glenn was from Canada. He was kind of the impromptu translator. And so when I arrived at the monastery, they took me on a walk around the grounds and everything. And it was everything I imagined it to be. It was nestled in the mountains. There were natural springs flowing down the mountains, and they carved out the tops of rocks, and the water would just flow into the rock, and you could just go pick up these elegant wood cups and drink mountain water. I mean, it was like straight out of a movie. And so for the first couple days, I'm thinking, hey, I'm living the dream. That's where my room was. A beautiful Buddha statue outside my room in the early morning light. I acclimated very well with the other monks. He's a little, that was sarcasm. Yeah, he was a little upset with me. He was the monk that oversaw me, and he caught me 3 times for sneaking out to get pizza at night, and actually had to move my room from that room to another room where I couldn't leave at night. So he wasn't happy with me. And this was the meditation hall, very idyllic, calm, tranquil. And so it was this perfect environment, and yet in the midst of this perfect environment, that was me. About 2 months later, 20 pounds lighter, more confused, more anxious, and more depressed than I had ever been in my life. And I remember writing in my journal, I traveled almost 7,000 miles, but my mind did not move. And this came as a shock and disappointment because I had hoped that by going somewhere far away, somewhere perfect, that I could escape myself, get away from all the anxiety and all the negative emotions and confusion and existential angst that I was experiencing at home. I got to meet Daehang Kunsanem, who is a famous meditation teacher in Korea, 3 times. And on this last time I went in, and I was miserable. And I went in wanting her to save me, wanting her to just tell me something that was going to make the clouds part and the light come in, and I was going to walk out of there with like a golden orb around me, just hovering above the ground, right? And we spoke through a translator, and I gave my whole spiel. She just listened and listened. And then we sat there quietly. And then she said something, and I was like, okay, here we go. And the translator said, go home. And I was like, excuse me? And then she said some more. She basically said, go home. You're running away from yourself. There's nothing for you here. Go home and learn to take care of yourself. This isn't about escapism. This is about being present. And right now, you're in a tailspin. I'm paraphrasing here, but you're in a tailspin and you're doing no one any good. Go home, one step at a time. You went from 0 to 100. And so the reason I talk about this is mindfulness is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all our problems. It's not going to make reality go away. And in fact, and I wish people would talk about this more, the things you don't necessarily like are actually going to become more apparent to you. And when you first start, that can be really destabilizing. And so on the front end, I know we love to talk about calm and peace, but calm and peace are not the target. Calm and peace are what happen when you learn to settle into your own experience and see it openly. And when you see it openly, you can let it go. And when you let it go, there's peace. But we want to skip all that part and manufacture the peace. Take it from me. You don't need to go to the other side of the world. You don't need to buy a meditation wardrobe or get the perfect everything to practice. Just start where you are and start slowly. Insight number 2, you don't have to have the answer. Almost exactly 7 years ago, I walked into my classroom here, and it had 21 freshman students in it who had just received word that their dear friend had walked out of the front doors of our school, across that lawn, and put himself down in front of a train. This was the second incident of 3 in about 2 months that unfolded almost in identical fashion. And as I walked into that classroom, I had just found out via email that this is what had happened. And I didn't know that my students would know yet. And as I walked in, as Jon Maher, who's over there, he's also at Lake Forest High School, he uses the term emotional triage, and that's exactly what it was. And so I walk into this room of 21 students in a state of emotional triage, and I had no idea what to do. And so I get in front of the class, and I see everyone just distraught. And I implicitly or unconsciously just put on myself the responsibility of having the answer. I had to say the right thing, and with every word that came out of my mouth, I saw that it was not impactful, and it wasn't helping. And at some point, it was almost an out-of-body experience. I just stopped, and I stepped out of that mode, and I walked over to 3 kids who were most noticeably crying to my left, and I just put my arms around them, and I hugged them. And then I started crying. And then other kids in the room started crying, and they started embracing each other. And to this day, I struggle to articulate what the level of connection and what we experienced in that classroom. Most of the kids from that class I still keep in touch with today. There was something special that happened. But I know this doesn't directly relate to mindfulness, but it indirectly relates in that who you are teaches more than any technique. And when we're coming into mindfulness, we're so worried about having the right technique or the right program. Or, do I count my breath 3 times and then hold my breath and then exhale for 10? Like, what do I do? Don't worry about all that. And especially if you're teaching it in your class, you are the teaching. Your practice, your confusion, your vulnerability, your insights, that's what drives mindfulness. Not sitting a particular kind of way, not any format, etc. And so in that moment in that classroom, not only as a teacher, but as a mindfulness teacher, I learned that important lesson that you don't have to say the right thing. You don't have to have the answer. Just be yourself. Allow yourself to be yourself. This one, I actually showed this to my students earlier this week, and they were totally confused by it. So let's see if you're confused by it too. So there's 4 images. The first 2 go together, and the second 2 go together. Okay? It's the first set. Did you get it? Okay, I thought it was them and not me. I said that to them. I'll let them know on Monday when I go back. Community is the highest expression of practice. And we live in a reductive culture that likes to reduce things to make them more convenient. And convenience is important, and convenience is helpful, especially on the front end. And convenience sometimes can help you in gaps where you can't maintain the level of commitment that you want. But eating a bunch of vitamins every day is not a meal. You can't live on that. That won't sustain you. Now you might go through periods of time where you have deficiencies, and vitamins are a huge help. And in the same way, apps are wonderful, and not just apps, but ways of making practice very accessible and convenient. And so I'm not bashing convenience. I want to make that clear, and I'm not bashing apps. But just remember that it's ultimately not a sustainable model. It will help you get by, it might help you get going, but it's not a sustainable model. And the last of the 4, mindfulness means to remember. I work with students all the time, I work with faculty all the time, and I work at other schools all the time. And the one line I hear more than anything else is, I don't have time. And so there is this pervasive sense of time scarcity everywhere. Time is a tyrant. It oppresses us. We're constantly chasing it, and it's always at least one step ahead. I've been working on this, trying to unpack the phenomenon of time scarcity. And it occurred to me that time scarcity, that stress is really a distorted relationship to time. And our distorted relationship to time is really a distorted sense of value. We're not clear about what we value. And when we're not clear about what we value, everything becomes urgent. Because there's no guiding framework or hierarchy to say what's important and what's not. Therefore, every email, every text, every moment of our day, we're inundated with things that take on this false sense of urgency. And we're running around, trying to put out urgency fires all day. And this leads to this indefinite state of just being preoccupied with insignificant things. Raise your hand if you feel like too often, at the end of the day, you've been going 1,000,000 miles per hour. You've done more things than you can even remember, that the morning seems like 8 days ago. And yet if someone were to say to you, what did you do today? You have no idea. You were just going. So I think it's really important to clarify what you value. And maybe you've done that. And I have my students do this. I say, I want your personal philosophy. Write it out. They write it out. I say, okay, cut it in half. They cut it in half. We share it. And then I say, now, 3 words or less. Personal philosophy. What is it? Write it down. Put it in your car. Put it in your locker. Put it on your mirror. Some kids like to put it on their ceiling so they wake up and they see their personal philosophy. It's not a trivial exercise. It's an important reminder of what's important. Because no one is going to tell you what's important, and no one's going to force you to honor what you think is important. And I think that's huge. The dark side of this is my good friend Søren Kierkegaard, 19th century Danish philosopher. The dark side of this process is something that I call drift when I'm talking to my students. And Kierkegaard has this wonderful, haunting quote. I'm going to paraphrase it here. He says, the greatest hazard in life is losing yourself. Because it's not like losing your car keys or your wallet or your phone or your purse. Because the self isn't an object. And it can quietly slip off and disappear into the world without you ever knowing. And I did a TED Talk about this. I experienced this firsthand when I was 17. I've actually kind of been obsessed with this reality. My grandfather was sick with cancer, and he lived with us last couple months of his life. And one night he was in our living room in his chair, and he just started to cry. He was not someone who would cry. My mom immediately comes over and she says, Dad, what's wrong? Should I call an ambulance? Do you need help? What's going on? And he said, no, it's not that. She said, well, what's going on? He said, it's just that I've lived 84 years and I have no idea what this life is about, and there isn't enough time to fix it. I was 17 years old when I heard that, and it scared me. And a few days after he died, I found this photograph of him when he was younger, in his 20s, fishing in Florida. And as I saw it, the image created this cognitive dissonance because I remember him when he passed away. And here he is smiling, the whole world in front of him, his future extending out in front of him. And I wondered if at that time he ever conceived of the possibility that his life would end the way it did, in regret. And that scared me. It scared the hell out of me. But the more I looked at the photograph, I then had the insight that, did I realize that someday I too would be an image in a photograph tucked away in some box? That was very frightening for me. We ask all the time, what is mindfulness? It's a good question, but when we ask the question, what is mindfulness? It leads us to certain pragmatic answers. It's attending to experience openly and non-judgmentally and all these things, and those are all important definitions. But if we slightly reframe the question to what does mindfulness mean, we get something different. Mindfulness comes from a Sanskrit word that means to remember. And so the question is what is it that we're remembering? We're remembering to come back to the present moment. We're remembering to come back to value. We're remembering to come back to connection. Because we forget. We so easily forget. We're all so busy, and we're more busy now than we've ever been in human history. And we can never before in human history have people been so capable of distracting themselves indefinitely. So we can forget in a way that's so totalizing that it's pretty remarkable. And so I just want to reiterate that mindfulness is interrupting those tendencies. It's interrupting the technologies that take us away from ourselves. It's interrupting the whole current of modern life that's pulling us in a direction we probably don't want to go. Every year I do this kind of thought experiment with my students, and I say, I want you to imagine a jar with 30,000 pebbles in it. And they say, well, why 30,000? And I say, because the average person lives about 30,000 days. But of course, that's not even guaranteed. And this morning, when you woke up, you pulled a pebble out of the jar of your life that will never be put back. There's no do-overs. And right now, as we sit here, are we remembering? Do we have a pebble in our hand? Are we remembering the value of that pebble? And are we acting in a way that's congruent with that value? I just want to finish quickly with how we've addressed some of these bigger ideas and issues at Lake Forest High School. As the well-being coordinator and learning facilitator, we created a professional development model that's largely in-house. Oh, I'm almost done. And it has three components: teacher identity, well-being, teacher well-being, and classroom practices. And typically professional development jumps to the third, classroom practices and experiences. And we think immediately about pedagogy and instruction and essential questions and enduring understandings and learning targets and all the cool stuff we talk about on Institute Days, right? But really, if we want to talk about authentic professional development, we have to start with how we as educators think about ourselves. And I always say to people, especially athletes, when I work with athletes, you cannot outperform your self-concept. Let me say that again. You cannot outperform your self-concept. And in an educational setting, you cannot outteach how you understand yourself. And if we walk around and go into different teachers' classrooms, it takes 3 seconds of walking into someone's room to just get an immediate intuition about where someone is kind of at, right? I'm not saying you can judge someone entirely by 3 seconds. That's absurd. But you can get a sense by the way the class is designed, by their body language, by the vocabulary that they're using, by the way the instruction has been designed, by who's doing the talking, who's doing the listening. So we always, with professional development, want to jump in and manipulate those things, but we don't realize that they're an extension and an expression of self-understanding. I have this talk a lot with, raise your hand if your school and maybe even you are obsessed with executive functioning. That's a big thing going on. You got a lot of freshman boys who are just a mess, right? They walk in, they've got one spiral with 100 different things in it. Like, what are you doing, right? So we see this and we're like, you're a mess. How are you going to succeed in life? You don't even put your papers into the right folder, right? And so then we sit there and we give them a whole litany of things to do to organize their reality, right? And how well does that work? They shove that right into the spiral with 1,800 other things. And it occurred to me at one point that organization occurs around purpose. If you have a vision and a purpose, you organize your reality around getting to that objective. But again, we just look at organization and think organization is the thing. No, having a purpose is the thing. If you help a kid find value in learning, and it's important, what are they going to do? They're just going to organize their reality around wanting to learn. And they're going to make it work. It might be in a form that's not, the gold standard of executive functioning at the moment. But how many of you do that? I mean, if we went to everyone's car right now and looked around, how would that turn out, right? Or your office or your desk or whatever. So, again, starting with teacher identity, it's so important because you cannot outperform your self-concept. Number two, well, let me go back to number one. So at Lake Forest, we did a lot of work, a whole year of late starts, 4 or 5 times each semester, where we worked on identity. Who am I as an educator? Why am I an educator? What formative experiences directed me towards education? How do I channel all of that into real-time, right now, teaching? Is there a disconnect? When did that disconnect open? Why did it open? Usually goes back to time. I had a particular teacher in one of those sessions get up, she started crying, and she went out into the hall. And I thought, oh my goodness, what did I say? So I went out and I said, are you okay? What's going on? And she just said, I didn't realize fully till this moment how far I've gone from where I started. And it was this overwhelming recognition for her. Once you have a sense of identity, start looking at how do we take care of ourselves? Before we walk into the classroom, how do we practice basic mindfulness? And this is when I left Korea, this is what I was really instructed to do, was basically, I call this wellness, right? Wellness is practical mindfulness. Do you sleep enough? Do you know how to manage your stress? Do you have a clear sense of what you value? Do you have the ability to say no to commitments that are not necessary? What do you eat every day? And not just what do you eat, but how do you eat? Do you eat on the run, flying through, shoving food into your mouth, going on to the next thing? Do you get enough physical activity, etc.? So practical mindfulness is well-being. And teachers, having been a teacher for 15 years, we don't take very good care of ourselves. We really don't. And it's because we're very good at putting other people in front of ourselves, taking care of other people's needs and not our own. And there's a whole piece that we focus on the difference between selfishness and self-care. Selfishness begins with you and it ends with you. Self-care starts with you, but it ends with other people. There's a huge difference. And then last, classroom practices. How do we take this better understanding, fuller understanding of our identity, our improved practices for making sure that we show up in the most optimal state, not just at work, but in life? And then how do we take that momentum and turn it into authentic learning experiences where we can help students do the same thing? So that's really what we've been focusing on at Lake Forest for really like the last 3 years. So that is it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Every single one of you at some point go up to Tracy and give her a hug, because literally this is her. And I'm so impressed that, I mean, having an idea and just bringing it to fruition in such little time is absolutely extraordinary. So thank you.